Hi everyone, in this video of Accelerated Chess Dragon, we're going to be looking at a game played between David Bronstein and Mikhail Botvinnik. This was played in the 1951 World Championship between the two of them, and Botvinnik is the champion and Bronstein is the challenger. So without further ado, let's look at this game. Bronstein starts off by playing d4, and we have e6 by Botvinnik. c4 and now f5, so the Dutch defense. g3, knight f6, and now bishop g2. And after bishop e7 and knight c3, castles e3 and d5, we have the classical Dutch. And after knight g2 and c6, we have somewhat of the stonewall variation of the Dutch. And this setup is primarily due to the pawn formation with pawns on f5, on e6, on d5, and c6, and it creates somewhat of a stone wall, or barrier, if you will, that kind of blocks any enemy pieces from getting through. So here b3 was played, and with this Bronstein's intention is to go bishop to b2 and hopefully try to fianchetto the bishop and activate it somehow. Although at the moment it doesn't look like it's going to really be useful because it looks very hard to get through that stone wall. But let's see what happens. Knight e4 is played by Botvinnik, and this is a very clear idea. The knight has somewhat of an outpost on the e4 square, and it's using this outpost to primarily activate its position, also trying to block out this bishop on g2, which at the moment was also not really doing anything, but this helps Botvinnik a lot more. The bishop's activity has been reduced a bit more now after this knight e4 move has been played. So, with fear of ideas like bishop to b4 and queen to a5, Bronstein just castles, and now knight to d7. You do not trade knights with knight takes c3, and this is because Botvinnik has a very strong knight on the e4 square. Unless the knight is provoked somehow with something like f3, then only will Botvinnik capture on c3 or maybe move the knight back. And the thing though about the f3 move is that it really blocks in this bishop on g2, which is already a bad bishop. Actually, both of white's bishops are bad bishops in this case, because both of them don't seem to have any way of actually getting activity. So, knight to d7. What Botvinnik is trying to do is bring his other knight to the f6 square. So, he is basically going to bring it here, and then perhaps, if ever this knight is captured with either the knight or the bishop, this other knight on f6 will now replace this knight on e4. So, bishop to b2. And, well, the knight is now defended again, and now maybe Bronstein has ideas of knight f4 and trying to look at this very weak e6 pawn. So knight df6 and queen to d3, and yet again there's more pressure towards the knight, so g5, and here c takes d5 is played by Bronstein. And he tries to exchange some pawns, but after e takes d5, the only thing that this really does is improve Botvinnik's position. Bronstein doesn't really have much of a way of proving himself to be good in this position. At the moment, Botvinnik can only do that. So he really needs to find some way of actually getting rid of either a superior knight or landing an outpost himself. And he gets rid of the superior knight on e4 with f3. The knights are exchanged on c3, although moving the knight back to d6 wouldn't really do anything at all, because the knight has no scope after it goes to the d6 square. Its possibilities of going anywhere after that are pretty limited. So knight takes c3 and bishop takes c3. Now this bishop all of a sudden becomes slightly better because you start considering ideas of e4, breaking through this somewhat shattered stone wall. And now after the bishop gets transferred to maybe d2, then there are clear ideas of what Bronstein is trying to do, set up an attack. So g4. And what is this g4 move trying to do? Well, first of all, it's trying to somehow activate this bishop on e7, because for the moment that g5 pawn was kind of blocking in this bishop, and that bishop didn't really have any scope after all. But now this bishop hopes to maybe get to somewhere like f6 or g7, and maybe help in the aid of this attack that is perhaps going to start in a couple of moves. So, f takes g4, and now knight takes g4. If you capture with f takes g4, then it would only help Bronstein after knight f4, and his knight is very nicely placed on the f4 square. and future ideas such as rook ae1 and e4 later on can always improve Bronstein's position. So knight takes g4. Knight f4 can still be played here, but now if you go knight f4, you see that you can now utilize this weak e3 pawn. If you see this position, you don't really find a clever way of actually weakening the pawn on e3, or at least finding ways to put pressure on the weakened e3 pawn. But now after knight f4 would have been played, e3 can be targeted by this knight, and then perhaps this rook later on, and even this queen. So now e3 is a target for Botvinnik if knight f4 was played. But instead, bishop to h3. And perhaps Bronstein not only thinks of eliminating that knight as soon as possible, but he's also trying to find purpose for his light squared bishop, which at the moment was not really doing anything on its lazy g2 square. So knight h6, moving the knight back, because obviously trading that bishop for knight would be a favorable exchange for Bronstein, considering that his bishop was really bad. And now knight to f4 is played. Bronstein uses the very active f4 square, because now knight g4 would only be met with bishop takes g4, and there's not really a lot of pressure towards the e3 pawn. And another thing about this bishop to h3 move is that it tries to indirectly prepare e4. Let's say that you didn't acknowledge this threat at all and you played something like b6. Well, then bishop takes g4, f takes g4, and e4. And sooner or later this bishop will get activity along some useful diagonals, and now Bronstein doesn't seem to be too bad. It actually brings us to the question of, does Botvinnik have anything now? Because now it seems that Botvinnik is worse. So, knight f4, bishop to d6, now trying to remove that knight on f4, or at least activate this bishop on d6 somehow. b4 is played. a6, preventing the move b5. And now a4 is played by Bronstein. And yet again, he's trying to reinforce the idea of b5. Now, had you played b5 in this position, would it really have worked out well for you? Considering after a takes b5, you play c takes b5. Do you have any chances here? Well, after you lose this d5 pawn, not exactly. Because, first of all, you weaken the d5 pawn, and secondly, now even if you try to get attacked with something like bishop takes g3, getting a discovery towards this knight, then white is completely unfazed. After simply h takes g3, queen takes d5, there's just bishop g2. And that rook on a8 isn't going to be there for any longer. So, that's just it. You cannot prevent the move b5. So, b5 is coming, and unfortunately for Botvinnik, he can't do anything about it. So, queen to e7. Preparing the move bishop takes b4, but rook a b1. Now, I don't really think that this rook ab1 move was the best idea. I think just going straight out for b5 would have been better, because b5 is trying to obviously weaken the d5 square, but there are some setbacks to this move b5. And what are those setbacks exactly? Well, first of all, there are ideas like putting pressure on this weak e3 pawn, and also, if you play a takes b5, rook takes a1, and now let's say rook takes a1, there is knight g4. And, well, now it doesn't really seem like you can target the d5 pawn anyway whatsoever. Because, well, this pawn on c6 is just going to stay there. And reinforced by this b pawn, you're not really going to find any way to deflect that c pawn from defending the d pawn. So, rook a to b1, and now b5. So, Botvinnik got the b5 move in, but is it really working now? Bishop to g2, and now knight to g4. So there's pressure towards e3, but now bishop to d2. After knight f6 is played here, an interesting move is played by Bronstein. He goes rook to b2. Now, why does he play this move? Well, this rook to b2 move hopefully tries to later on bring this bishop out to c3, and then bring the rook over to e2 or f2 and get some activity that way. So bishop d7, and with this move, Botvinnik finds a way of activating his last piece, which I believe he should have activated a little bit earlier, and he has the plan of going bishop to e8 and then bishop to g6 later on. Not at the moment because f5 is weak. But after something like knight e4 and then bringing the bishop out to g6, then maybe Botvinnik has chances. Because, first of all, he would get the outpost back because now the f-pawn is no longer controlling that. And simply the active bishop could really do something for Botvinnik. So rook a1 is played here by Bronstein. He wants to seize the a file. Knight to e4, and now bishop to e1. Although this bishop is a bad bishop, Bronstein wants to keep it, which is a bit strange. But he realizes that b4 is a very weak pawn, and that if b4 falls, then perhaps there are chances rook f to e8. And Botvinnik is now piling up on that e3 pawn. Queen goes to b3, and now king to h8, sidestepping any ideas of, say, knight takes d5, using the pressure towards the king using that diagonal. And now rook b to a2. And now the idea becomes clear. What Bronstein is trying to do with this move is he's trying to somehow activate his rooks using the a file. So queen to f8, and now knight to d3. The knight wasn't doing anything on f4, so now knight c5 is the next destination. Rook a b8, a takes b5, and now a takes b5, protecting the pawn, but the rook now uses the rook uses the 7th rank. So rook to e7 and knight to e5, yet again attacking the bishop. You cannot exactly win a pawn with bishop takes e5, d takes e5, and rook takes e5 because your bishop is hanging. Now, what happens if you did all of this but you moved your bishop back to try simply attacking the pawn again? Well, if you did this, then after bishop takes e4, f takes e4, Bronstein actually has a pretty good move here. And I encourage you to pause the video and try finding out what it is. Okay, the move is actually to play e6, and it's a very nice clearance sacrifice. Now, if you remember from the video I made on the clearance sacrifice, it basically sacrifices some material to open up certain lines against your opponent. And in this case, it opens up the a1, h8 diagonal. And if you look at what piece is on that diagonal, it's the king. And if you also notice something else, that this bishop is now able to access that diagonal. And it's going to be a very tough position for Botvinnik now. So bishop takes e5 could work, although there is trouble after this e6 move. So bishop to e8 is played, trying to reinforce c6 because if you let that fall, then you're just losing the d5 pawn next. So g4, attacking the f5 pawn, and now f takes g4 is played. Why don't you capture the e5 pawn now? Well, it's essentially the same idea with the bishop takes e4 followed by bishop c3 idea. So f takes g4, and here bishop takes e4 is played. D takes e4, and I'm not going d5 or anything like that, but instead Bronstein plays the move bishop to h4, and now he's using the very powerful diagonal here, and he's also having ideas of knight f7 check and something like that. At the moment, if you trade rooks, then it only helps Bronstein's cause, because he's going to go knight f7 check, he has queen e6 threats pending, and, well, how does Botvinnik really resolve any of this? There's not really a clear idea. So, rook takes a7 doesn't work. Instead, Botvinnik unfortunately has to give up the exchange. So he goes rook takes e5, d takes e5, and now bishop takes e5. Now after the dust has settled, we see this. Bronstein has 3 pawns, Botvinnik has 5 pawns. So Botvinnik has 5 pawns, but he's down the exchange. So the material would be equal, right? Well, yes, but if you look at the activity of Bronstein's pieces, they simply compensate for the extra 2 pawns that Botvinnik won when he won the exchange. So now rook to f1. And it would be really nice if you could go bishop takes h2 check, because you simply check the king, and if you take the bishop, then queen takes f1. And this is winning, right? Well, almost. Unfortunately, Bronstein has his final tactical blow, and he can choose between going queen to b2 check or queen to c3 check. Either one of these 2 moves essentially wins the game for Bronstein. After queen c3, if you go king g8, then there's queen g7 mate. So you must block with the queen, but that is obviously ridiculous, and it just prolongs the game for no reason. So bishop h2 check doesn't work. So queen g8. And what Botvinnik is trying to do with this move is he's trying to trade more pieces off. But unfortunately, this is where Bronstein finds a very clever idea. He plays the move bishop to g3. And this is very nice, because if you play bishop takes g3 here, then there's queen c3 or queen b2. It really doesn't matter. And after this, you must block with bishop e5, and then you must block with the queen. And you simply just lose your material back, and you're also going to lose checkmate. Bishop back to g7. But here's the problem with that move. Now your rook is being attacked by this bishop on g3. And after queen takes g8 check, Botvinnik simply resigned. Because after king takes g8, he's simply going to lose his rook. And now it's simply 2 rooks against a bishop. And that's an easy win for Bronstein. So that's the end of the game. I hope you all enjoyed it. And if you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comments section. And stay tuned for more chess.